Okay, so I'm going to pick up where I left off. This is week 13, part 2, the lecture on chapter 2 of Settler Colonialism by Lorenzo Veracini. Um, the idea that individual sovereignty, as I was sort of describing in the last video, is rooted against this collective sovereignty within the nationhood, especially within imperial nationhood, really sort of like frames what Veracini describes as settler sovereignty, right? But I think what we connect this idea to is what Veracini describes as separation, right? The idea that the settler is constantly wanting to uproot and move toward a new possible future that might, for example, present them with an opportunity to create a new political order that's much more suitable to the sort of imaginary that the settler has. This is what brought the settler from Europe to the United States. This is what made the settler reject their sort of like colonial identity, nation-wise, I should say, and then create a new sort of like fantasy on the frontier. It's also interesting to see how that even after the formation of what was the original 13 colonies as the United States, you see that at the beginning of the 19th century, there were still groups of settlers who wanted to move out of that political order into a new political order and to develop their own sort of like system of I guess what Veracini would describe as isopolitics or isolationist politics. But in many ways, as each one of those groups moved out and separated from the colonies, they were quickly then usurped into that sort of statehood relationship that I described in the last video, this settler contract, where while each state developed its sort of like new colonizing exploitation relationships amongst the natives and the exogenous groups that were coming, we also see how quickly the group of state interests that wanted to incorporate those colonies back into statehood followed. And I think this is what eventually gets us to this like creeping and then unionizing, creeping and then unionizing, creeping and unionizing that we described in Hickson's book, all the way to the west, and then of course to now Hawaii, Alaska, and beyond. So this notion of separation is important for Veracini to describe how the settler characterizes themselves against the political order, but I think it also gets to this idea that it's a lifestyle. So for Veracini, the settler sovereignty is an expression of individuality, political individuality. But in many ways, what we see Veracini describe it as is a settler kind of like lifestyle. It's a way of living for a group of people who are constantly, let's say, separating from a political order that no longer serves them into an imaginary political order or an imaginary political future where they are completely in charge of organizing the sets of relationships that benefit them. In many ways, settler sovereignty is still something that we see happening today. Settler sovereignty, in my opinion, is what drives corporate ventures to gentrify neighborhoods. It's what drives individuals to feel like they can hold their ground with certain like rights over people in a dispute. I think like stand your ground laws are an expression of the settler sovereignty, where at any moment an individual can claim that a space that they're occupying, which was not their space to begin with, is defendable by force. And that defendable by force narrative really is rooted in this idea of individual sovereignty over communities of color that the settler European groups brought with them to the United States. So the last thing I'll say about settler sovereignty and the way it sets up this notion of settler consciousness is that the primary mode of settler sovereignty is violence. It's theft, it's extraction of individuals' property from that individual, and it's enslavement. It's trapping individuals into exploitative relationships where labor is removed from the body and then that body is discarded, right? Those sorts of like modes of settler sovereignty, in my opinion, are still very much embedded in much of our sort of corporate statehood, individualism, American sort of ideology. And I think that if we start to interrogate those, we might see how we could resist those temptations to perpetuate violence. So The question I have for you today is, I would like you to give me one example of settler sovereignty and how it might manifest today in today's political society. There's probably plenty of examples you can use. Given the criteria that we've talked about, I'd like you to write your paragraph around what examples of settler sovereignty you see in our real world today. So thanks again, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.